special guest joining Andy for a discussion before the concert, and that's Caroline Webber. And so I'll just say a word about her briefly to introduce her before she comes to the stage. Caroline is an associate professor of French at Barnard College, where she's also affiliated with the Comparative Literature program. She's a specialist of 18th century French literature and culture, with a particular focus on the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And her other research and teaching interests also include critical theory, gender studies, and history of fashion. Caroline's books on revolutionary France include Terror and Its Discontent, Suspect Words in Revolutionary France, and Queen of Fashion, What Marie Antoinette Wore to the Revolution, which was selected by both the New York Times and the Washington Post as a notable book of the year. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it yet, I hope that you'll go immediately home and order it online or go to a bookstore tomorrow and get it. It's really a brilliant, meticulously researched and beautifully written account of the fashion, the role fashion played in Marie Antoinette's life before and during the Revolution, from the ceremonial stripping of her Austrian clothing when she crossed the border to come to marry the Dauphin at age 14, to the stripping of her closets at Versailles by revolutionary crowds. So I highly recommend the book, which I think Andy also has a great appreciation for. Caroline's also very interested in French culture and literature at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, and is a specialist among other, of Proust among other authors. Her current book project is called Proust's Duchess, and she looks at several famous salonières in Proust's social set at the turn of the last century. And so for this reason, her expertise on both the 18th century and the early 20th century, and the connections between those time periods, and for many other reasons that will become evident when you hear her speak, we're really delighted to welcome Carrie Webber to join Andy Apparel, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming both of them. Thank you.
I need to add to what Shani said about the Marie Antoinette book, was that we have various people who write history beautifully, colorfully. I think of Simon Schema and his books he's like a history painter. But the thing about Marie Antoinette and what she wore to the Revolution is that what Caroline has done is she has allowed us to see changing power structures through the gift of some diamonds, or a shocking usurping of an idea of fashion by a group of revolutionaries who are in fact screaming for the execution of the woman who invented that fashion. So that you see how, in a very moving way, and in a way that really pulls size from you, of how history works. And it isn't that the actual fashion items are so important, is that they are the windows into what's happening all around, and that we can envision the hairstyles that are spoken about, and the different fabrics that are used. Allows us to enter in a very tangible way this very volatile world that Caroline has written about. So I recommend it to all of you, and I'm certainly thinking that the next book is going to be quite wonderful. I just wanted to, when we organized the series, we thought the first concert would be about the past, about the 17th century, and Rameau and Leclair, who are great voices of the 18th century, and then the middle concert would be about the countryside and the influence of a less sophisticated society on that music and how that was inspiring. And this last one, there was this long period of time when no one really thought there was much value to Rococo or to any of these 18th century creators in music, in literature, in painting, and then all of a sudden, there was this explosion of interest in it. And it was an explosion of interest which was of great inspiration to composers who were beginning to find themselves drained of what do we do next. We have this tradition that we have, a tradition that comes from Cherubini and Rossini and Meyerbeer and Offenbach and Chopin and Liszt, none of them French, none of them coming from a French tradition of music. And so there was a kind of being lost, and there were other reasons why the French needed this 18th century. And the people who we think of almost right away who are sent to this are these brothers named the Goncourt brothers. And I think that if you don't know them, you'll be happy to know about them, though you probably won't like them. I would love to ask you first to introduce us to these people, these important people.
Oh, sure, yeah, and in fact, so first of all, I want to thank you so much. I'll keep it short because we have a lot to talk about. I'll be very loud. Also, thank you, Shani, and thank you, Andy, for the incredible, generous introductions. I wish I've got a bunch of crates of unsold copies of Queen of Fashion at home. I would have given them away as prizes, but next time. Anyway, no, so I was thinking when you were talking about looking at history through the lens of these kind of seemingly disposable or fungible or minor arts or minor forms of cultural expression, which is what I obviously I tried to do in Queen of Fashion, studying the late 18th century and the life of Marie Antoinette. But that's actually really a sort of a method that I would say begins with the Goncourt brothers. They were this very, very interesting pair of brothers who were aesthetes and collectors and writers, novelists, playwrights. They lived together, they worked together, they never married. One was born in 1822 and the other in 1830, Edmond and Jules. And Edmond was the older one who lived longer and was the even crustier, nastier one. There are a lot of things about them politically that aren't very pleasant, but the great contribution that they made, from my point of view, to cultural history was that they essentially single-handedly revived an interest in Second Empire France and Third Republic France, so the 1860s and then the 1870s, 80s, and 90s in 18th century culture. In the kind of face of all of the gaudy excesses of Napoleon III's Paris, the Goncourt brothers noticed that a lot of these wonderful drawings and paintings from the Rococo period before the Revolution were undervalued, and nobody cared about them, and they were essentially being sold as nothing at all. And they developed this incredible collection, and because they were writers and scholars as well, they also studied at length and wrote several books about mostly the women of Ancien Regime France. They wrote a famous book about Madame de Pompadour, Louis XV's most famous, most influential mistress. They wrote a book about Marie Antoinette. They wrote a book about woman in the 18th century, and they famously declared the 18th century the century of the woman. And they get made fun of by subsequent historians for having, for instance, in their descriptions of the French Revolution, talked a lot about what plates get broken, what china figurines get shattered, and very little about what the actual political stakes were and why people were rioting and storming palaces and things. But so they paid this incredibly close attention in their writing and also in their collecting to the fine arts, the decorative arts of 18th century France. And because they were men of taste, they were men who were very involved in the world of arts and letters in Paris. They were close with a number of especially very, very influential French writers who were their contemporaries, from Flaubert to Maupassant, most notably. And so their influence was huge. And it was really thanks to them that we see this kind of vogue in really the early part of the Third Republic in France, that we see this vogue kind of coming back into a big prominent presence in Parisian culture for specifically Louis XV and Louis XVI furniture, paintings, drawings, and even styles of dress.
Now, you mentioned to me their attitude, their kind of attitude about kind of the middle class and nobility, and how they disliked the middle class, and that they saw this 18th century as a kind of repairing of taste and things like that. What is their relationship to society?
Yeah,
they're
incredible snobs. And that's one of the reasons that they're kind of, it's fun to read them if you want to love to hate who you're reading. They have great lines like, the bourgeoisie is an ocean of nothingness. They themselves were actually not, they had the sort of the particule that implied a level of nobility, that it was bogus. Their great-grandfather had bought some land in the 18th century and had kind of taken it upon himself to add de Goncourt, which was the name of the land. But they affiliated themselves with the kind of Ancien Regime nobility, and with this ideal of all of this lost elegance and all of these lost manners and all of this lost pedigree that was under threat by the rising tide of bourgeois success and power specifically in the Third Republic, but even in the kind of parvenu regime of Napoleon III under the Second Empire. Their father and their uncle were both heroes in Napoleon's great army, so they had an interesting, they tried to claim for themselves this sort of position as the spokespeople of the fallen Ancien Regime, but their own family ties and family background were a bit murkier than that.
Right.
But they really stood very firmly for France as an aristocratic ideal that was shattered by the revolution and that the bourgeoisie was kind of making worse every day. They were specifically threatened by Jewish people, and the anti-Semitism in their journals, which they kept assiduously for decades, and Edmond alone after his brother died. And the anti-Semitism comes out on almost every other page. So it's sometimes it can be fairly appalling stuff to read, but they're fascinating as lenses on the society that they were such an important part of.
Yeah, and there are two things that come to mind that I wanted to mention here. And one of them is that if we remember last talk, Tav Holmes talked about Watteau, who was someone that the Goncourt would have loved extraordinarily, and they would have said, what incredible refined art this is this aristocratic ideals. But if we remember what Tav said, it was not the aristocracy that bought Watteau at all. This was painting for the bourgeoisie, for the rising class, middle class in 18th century France. So they really have it wrong in some basic ways, and their motivation for having us look at this 18th century art again, which has extraordinary effect on painters and writers and musicians, their motivation is incorrect, but the effect of it is very positive. So I think that's a very interesting thing. Similarly, when I read Debussy writing about Rameau, Debussy adored Rameau. He writes about Rameau all the time. And well, one of the things he says early on in his book was that Rameau was ignored in his own lifetime. So there too, I mean, Rameau was the most powerful and successful musician in Paris. So there's all this incorrect information in this revival that's happening, but it's not so important as the fact that there's this new passion that's growing, a new understanding of the communicative and aesthetic value of the stuff that had been so ignored for so long. So you have this anti-Semitism. Now, many of you may have read The Hare with the Amber Eyes. Raise your hand if you've read The Hare with the Amber Eyes. Well, the Goncourt brothers are listed in there as the most virulent anti-Semites that are mentioned in Paris. So you'll recognize them from that book, but they are an important cultural institution, the two brothers. Also, one of the greatest literary prizes in France today is the Prix Goncourt for literature. Right. There are two kinds of nationalism in France at the time of the Goncourt that are developing. And one of them is the Goncourt nationalism, and then the other one is the Debussy nationalism. And do you want to mention something about that? Do you want to?
Well, you start.
Well, one of them is, the Goncourt is that France is the church and the king. And the other one is France is the Republic and the Age of Enlightenment. And these are two very powerful national feelings that coincide and conflict. However, they agree on a lot of the things that they think are valuable about their culture. It's just that the fundamental motivation is so different one from the other.
Yeah. No, and that the stakes of both of those perspectives become much higher after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, 1871. When the Germans lay siege to Paris, and you've all probably read stories about people eating rats and escaping in balloons and all those incredible stories of that time. But in the wake of that event, the threat again of what Prussia is going to do next is real, and the political situation in France. And one of the characters I'm writing about in this book about Proust and kind of fin de siècle society is the English ambassador Lord Lytton, whose father is the man who invented the phrase "the pen is mightier than the sword." But Lord Lytton said something like, France's government, the government of the Third Republic, is like Napoleon's armies, soldiers. They are wearing out so many boots that they're never going to get anywhere. Basically, every time you turn around, there's a new president of the Third Republic. Anything can happen. There are people who are still hoping to restore one of the Bourbon heads of the Comte de Chambord, the head of the Bourbon royal family, the last survivor pretended to the throne. People who are hoping to restore the Orléans people. So it really matters how people are conceiving of what France is and what matters about it and what values should be protected, preserved, and enshrined in the governmental order that grows up and out of the ruins of the Franco-Prussian War. And Goncourt, Edmond de Goncourt, the nastier, older, and longer lived of the two brothers, I always find it kind of funny poetic justice that he died in 1896, very shortly before the Dreyfus affair began, because he would have been such an unpleasant, loud voice on the side of the anti-Semites, complaining about how the Jews are ruining France and all of that. But so yeah, it's politically it's tremendously important for all of these people to be thinking about what the values are, that what is Frenchness,
Yeah.
and what political program of Frenchness is going to be advanced and is going to prevail.
Now, one of the things that for the musicians and for the music you'll be hearing tonight happened in the 18th century and with Marie Antoinette was that what was French in music was set aside by a wave of appreciation for a new kind of what they called reform opera. Marie Antoinette brought Gluck to France with her, and Gluck was, though he had learned a lot from Rameau, he was really putting out something very different than this tradition of French music. And it was, Debussy considers Gluck as one of the first perversions of music in France, and where the French took the wrong route. And he says the Austrian princess, which of course they called her in the 18th century in such a derogatory way. Even Debussy says the Austrian princess. Well, you know, finally, in the 18th century, when they said the Austrian princess is so horrible, they actually loved what she was bringing in. They loved Gluck. Gluck was really, it was time for that. But for Debussy, what he was saying was we had a tradition and a set of aesthetic values about music which simply disappeared even before the revolution because there was this wave of interest in things that were Germanic. And Gluck was from Austria. And that follows very quickly on where you have Italians and Germans coming to France, where Beethoven becomes the rage. Ultimately, all the operas are written, all the French operas are written by German composers. Actually, many of them German-Jewish composers. Halévy and Meyerbeer were both Jewish, and they were the center of operatic life. And Debussy wants to find in his nationalism and in his need to see, you know, what is French and what will make my music, will liberate me to be something different than I feel that I've been sort of tied into from this newer tradition in France. He looks to Rameau and to Couperin, and so does Ravel look to Rameau and Couperin. We know that they listened very, very often to these composers. Debussy died. The last piece he was writing was a quartet with harpsichord in it. And they both wrote, you know, Hommage à Rameau is Debussy and Tombeau de Couperin is Ravel. They were both very involved with this, and for them, the less, if you want, the less interesting part was a kind of nationalism. There's more interesting things that I'll tell you about after, but what I would like to do is that since you are writing about these salons that take place in the 19th century, and the salon is such an 18th century institution with Madame de l'Épinasse and all these people, can you tell us something about these salons that you're talking about, their relationship with the arts? And
yeah, with pleasure. And so I'm writing a book about these three women who were kind of, in different ways, leaders of French society, both social society, upper class society, and also artistic and cultural society in Paris in the 1880s and 90s specifically was kind of the heyday of all three of these women. Their names were the Comtesse Greffule, the Comtesse Adéome de Chevigné, and Madame Strauss, born Halévy, the daughter of Fromental Halévy, who wrote La Juive. And all three of these women had salons that were tremendously influential in the arts in Paris in the 1880s and 90s. And one of the things that's really interesting about them is the kind of different positions that they occupy with respect to reclaiming of a particular kind of French tradition, even in music. So the Comtesse Greffule, as you and I were talking about the other day on the phone, Fauré was the organist at the Church of the Madeleine, which was her regular church. And so she kind of discovered Fauré in that way and decided that because there were also works, she was a tremendously musical woman herself, born a Belgian princess, but given a very intense and unusually good musical education. She decided that there were lots of works by Berlioz and Debussy specifically that were neglected, that needed to be revived in France. And so in 1891, using her own money, she had huge amounts of money from her husband, she founded a group called the Société des Grandes Auditions Musicales de France. And its whole aim was to revive and draw attention to and have big kind of splashy society gala performances featuring music by Berlioz, Debussy, Fauré. She had a little fête galante in 1894 on the island in the Bois de Boulogne with the Clair de Lune of both Debussy and Fauré, and the Debussy one, as we were talking about, is inspired by Verlaine, inspired by Watteau, so there's this kind of tremendous reprise of an 18th century kind of set of cultural gestures by the Comtesse Greffule. And then Madame Strauss was very interesting because her salon became the center for Dreyfusism once the Dreyfus affair happened. And so she was this woman who was known to be kind of very frivolous, very bright. She was thought to be the funniest woman in Paris. Proust, pretty much all of the jokes that he ascribes to his supposedly witty Duchesse de Guermantes, for whom Madame Strauss and these two other women served as the models, they all come from Madame Strauss. And even though she had grown up as both the daughter of Fromental Halévy and then she was the wife of Georges Bizet, she had no real interest in talking about culture. She thought it was kind of tacky because, of course, the artists one knew were the best artists. And of course, the artists one's husband collected. Her husband was an illegitimate Rothschild. He had incredible Natiers and Watteau and Hubert Robert. Of course, one's husband has the best paintings. One doesn't talk about them. She was not at all interested in politics, and then the Dreyfus affair happened, and this woman who was born Jewish on both sides of the family became incredibly engagée. So she's very interesting. And then the Comtesse de Chevigné, who was Proust's sort of physical model for the Duchesse de Guermantes, this icon of aristocratic elegance in the Recherche du Temps Perdu, she was the great-granddaughter of the Marquis de Sade. So the 18th century influence comes back in a slightly different way with her. She was known to be the first society woman in Paris to say the word merde in public. So that's her contribution to French letters. But yeah, so the salons were really, really interesting. And people there's a funny story about it might have been the Princess Mathilde Bonaparte who was a great, figure of salonière during the Second Empire, and she loved poor artists and struggling artists, and she was very troubled one day when Verlaine didn't show up to dinner. She said, "Oh well, whatever happened to Monsieur Verlaine? Oh well, he died. Oh well, that's too bad because he missed a good party," or whatever the story was. I'm sorry that he died. So there is this real kind of cultural foment in these salons that's very exciting.
It also reminds me of the wit of the 18th century salons. For instance, there's one that you might be able to tell me which one this was, of a woman who had a salon who had the Archbishop of Paris there with her and some philosophers, and they were talking about the saints and miracles. And she was mentioning that she had a hard time believing in miracles, and the Saint-Denis came up, whose head was chopped off on Montmartre, and then he walked something like 20 kilometers with his head in his hand, and then he put it down at Saint-Denis, and that's where the great cathedral is, the first Gothic cathedral in France, and where the kings are buried. So she expressed grave doubts about this happening, and the Archbishop of Paris, who was a little scandalized by this, said to her, "Do you mean that you do not believe that our beloved Saint Denis walked with his head 20 kilometers? And she said, "I have no problem with the 20 kilometers. I have a problem with the first step." Yeah, that's the spirit of that seems to continue through.
That's right, and Proust always said that the Esprit de Guermantes, which he ascribes to this fictional duchess based on the three women I was talking about, the Duchesse de Guermantes, he always said that he did that. He invented that quality for one of his characters because it drove him crazy reading Saint-Simon's memoirs of the end of the reign of Louis XIV, where Saint-Simon talks endlessly about the wit of the Mortemart. And one of the Mortemart was Athénaïs de Montespan, one of the mistresses of Louis XIV. And Proust made the obvious point, but that I had never thought about before, which is that Saint-Simon talks endlessly about how funny the Mortemart were, but he never gives an example of their wit. And the wit that Proust kind of ascribes to the Guermantes, this kind of most aristocratic family in his novel, really does, and a number of the people contemporaries of, for instance, Madame de Chevigné, who was also very funny, the great-granddaughter of the Marquis de Sade. I believe that it was Jacques-Émile Blanche, a portrait painter in the late 19th century and popular with society, said that when she spoke, she exhaled 18th century wit. And so that kind of dry, ironic funny toss-away lines, and like I have trouble with the first step. That really is in the lineage with 18th century court culture.
Right. So then that takes us to the two people who we need to talk about a little bit, and that's Proust and Debussy. And you had mentioned to me Proust's attitude towards 18th century stuff, and it isn't really very positive on the surface.
Yeah.
So what does he think of the fête galante and 18th century France?
Yeah, no, I mean, although I think that having thought about this more for our conversation, I think that I have to revise my opinion of Proust's opinion, which is Proust hated 18th century writers, and as an 18th century literature scholar, that hurts me, because I love Proust. There's nobody better than Proust. There's no writer greater than Proust. And yet, when he kind of sort of disparages 18th century writing, I realize that what he's really disparaging is the philosophes, and that Proust loved also that kind of elegant wit. Proust did like Leclair. He liked the libertine tradition. He makes some references to Sade. I'm not sure how much Sade he actually read, or how much Sade was even available for reading it in Proust's time. But Proust, some of his first kind of public artistic expressions were this series of verbal portraits of painters and musicians, he called them, portraits de peintres et de musiciens, that were published in 1896 on the front pages always, I think, of the Gaulois, the big society newspaper, but maybe the Figaro, and then they were published again in a collection, and they were set to music by his boyfriend, the composer and pianist Ronaldo Hahn. And one of the prettiest ones of these poems is about Watteau, and it really strikes a kind of a Goncourtian note about the sort of the lost elegance and the fragile beauty of the 18th century that is no more. And when he writes about Watteau, that's what he writes about, and there is a kind of a real appreciation in Proust for that, I think, and in many ways, the kind of the scene at the end of the À la recherche du temps perdu, which is set sometime right after World War I, and is in the 7th volume of Proust's 7-volume novel, published posthumously in 1927. Proust has this ball where all of the Guermantes and all the people he used to know in society get together, and Proust walks in and says, not Proust, the narrator of the novel, named Marcel, walks into the party and says, "Gosh, this is funny. Nobody told me that this was a costume party and that we were all supposed to come dressed as our own death's head. But in fact, I guess that's what we were supposed to do, and it's just that everybody has aged so much that he used to know in society." And so he goes on to refer to it as the bal de tête, the head ball. But what that's referring to is one of the greatest parties of the 1880s in Paris, hosted by the Princesse de Sagan, which was called the Bal des Bêtes, where everyone was asked to come out as dressed as their favorite animal from Buffon, the 18th century naturalist Buffon's Histoire naturelle. So even this kind of idea in Proust of the last gasp of the fin de siècle aristocracy that's dying and dying off, and whose power will, as limited as it was before World War I, is really over with World War I. That the last gasp of that, this grotesque ball that he attends, is given this name that's so closely associated with a party that was modeled on kind of 18th century taxonomies. So there's a deeper relationship than I think he was maybe willing to admit, and it's a lovely one.
And what's also interesting to hear is that so often when people talk about the past, and I think this is generally the case, is that when we idealize the past, we clean it up. We take out what we don't know how to balance in our sense of what we want it to be. And so it becomes, it's very often when Four Nations plays for high school kids or even adults, and they say, oh, this is so much like, people in beautiful costumes dancing. Well, it really isn't. It's much more complicated than that. It's much more rich. It involves many more influences and many more feelings than just dancing in a beautiful room. And in fact, the 18th century and what goes into what people love in the 19th century is much more complicated than just the vision of some aristocracy that's no longer there, because we know that the middle class and their sense of what it was that was value played a great deal of great influence on this art that they love in the late 19th century, but they define it differently. And what does happen is that since someone is finally saying we really need to go back to, we need this for some reason, we need a kind of idealized past to love because we're having a really hard time with right now, is that whatever their reasons, whatever their definitions, what they're doing is they're pulling out an art which stands so well on its own feet that it can exist with so many different definitions of its motivation. And so that the art is this to this. Yeah, I'd like just to take a minute to talk about Debussy and the past and why Debussy was so invested in 18th century stuff. And he talks, he's always talking in his, because he was a music critic, he's always talking about Rameau, about, we need to go back to Rameau. And what he says is that Rameau's music has the most beautiful and kind of perfumed, unaggressive way of touching us, of caressing us. And what came in its place was this spectacular, obvious harmonies that excite us, but never get to this point of being so beautifully modulated, so much, if you want, art for art's sake. And Tab told us that these paintings by Watteau were not, they were not didactic, they didn't have a moral, they didn't even have a story, they were simply art for art's sake. And what we see in the Impressionists is that they're rejecting French academic art, which usually had some sort of moralistic fabric to it, or some kind of moral or underlining some attribute or something like that. And the painters thought this was, childish, middle-class stuff. Because in fact, middle class does change a certain amount, and when you think about middle-class values, we think about Greuze, we think about those painters that come in, but not the painters that think we are entitled simply to delight in what we see, to delight in what we hear. And the Impressionists said, we are not writing little Bible stories here, or we are going to show you something, and we're going to teach your eyes how to see, and we're going to let your eyes enjoy what's there. It's simply art for art's sake. And Debussy felt the same way. He did not want to rush. He didn't want to feel as if, like German structural harmony, you had to go from point A to point B to point C. He wanted to listen to a beautiful harmony and let it float in the air, and let himself enjoy it the way he felt Rameau did to music, and what he felt Couperin did to music. It wasn't that it had to be a sonata form, or it had to be this form or that form. It simply had to be music there to digest, to enjoy. And Rameau, I think I mentioned last time, maybe I mentioned it, Rameau liberated music from counterpoint. He said that music was really about harmony. Counterpoint and all those strict rules that come from the Renaissance, it's only decoration, it's harmony. Debussy, looking towards Rameau, says it's not even about functional harmony. It's simply about beautiful sounds placed where you want them to be on the page, and the structure of the music simply comes from those sounds, which is extraordinarily revolutionary because it allows almost for anything. But he gets this by listening to this French music, which takes its time, which doesn't have these, enormous climaxes that are based in what chord goes to what chord and what dissonance goes to what dissonance. He simply allows us to love sound and to take sound as its own structural element. That's a big deal, and that comes straight from that. In another way, Ravel, who also loves Couperin, was not willing to give up the harmony that has its rules, but he imitates and copies Couperin a great deal. And just as, you'll hear this in a second, but just as an example of this, in one of the harpsichord pieces I'm going to play, there's a section of it that goes. All those beautiful seventh chords going nowhere, that's 1728. And Ravel hears that and he thinks, oh, my valse noble et sentimentale that have these chords with these beautiful dissonant notes in them, but they just sort of float all over the place, comes straight out of this 18th century music. And the Fête Galante, these paintings that we talked about last time, Verlaine writes a series of poems called Fête Galante that are set by Debussy, Fauré. Everyone sets these. This is this door opening into the 18th century, which we feel very much when we play our music, our 18th century music. What you'll hear tonight is some of this 18th century music, and we've chosen things that are not like last time, the wild peasant dances and things like that. We've chosen things that just seem to float beautifully. The values that Debussy and Ravel so admired in this music, we're not going to be exciting tonight. We're going to be something else. But I think you'll hear this constant beauty and this art for art's sake. But then you'll hear Debussy's quartet. And Debussy writes this quartet wanting this ability, and certainly achieving it, to suspend sound, the most beautiful sound, imitating sighs and beautiful, you know, the nape of the neck of Watteau you can hear in Debussy all the time. But he does it after listening to Wagner and after listening to Beethoven. So it's got to be different. But we think that you'll hear this love and this entitlement simply to the pleasure of art for art's sake. Tell us a little about the book and when we're going to get it.
Oh gosh. Well, the book is due this. My book is due this fall, and supposedly will be ready this fall and out next fall. But I was actually, when I was thinking about music in Proust in preparation for our talk tonight, I noticed that there are great moments of humiliation, of cultural humiliation and social humiliation by different characters throughout Proust's novel, and it's one of the sort of, for me, the pettier great pleasures of that book. And there's a scene late in the novel, in maybe volume 4 or 5, where the Madame de Cambremer, who kind of represents this ersatz aristocracy. She's from a bourgeois family in Cambrai, and her brother is the Saint Sebastian of snobism, who kind of doesn't want to admit that he knows any bourgeois people when his newly aristocratic sister is around. And all she loves, we're told, is Debussy and Impressionism. And so she's at this salon hosted by the Verdurins, Madame Verdurins, who's this kind of great, rich, blue stocking who loves Wagner especially, and who gets these migraines because she can't stand how wonderful Wagner is. They have Morel, the new kind of society pianist, little pet of the salon. Madame de Cambremer keeps saying, "Oh, I must hear my Debussy. I love my Debussy. Please play me some Debussy." And Morel, it's like, "Well, I'd rather be playing cards." The genius is, "I'd rather be playing cards, but okay, I guess I'll play for you." Starts playing Debussy, and Madame de Cambremer is exclaiming, "Sublime, sublime," and he switches into Meyerbeer, and she keeps yelling, "Sublime, my sublime Debussy," and then he finally tells her what he's done. So one of the great kind of humiliation moments in the Recherche is precisely this failure to appreciate the difference between those two musical idioms. But it's a world, I loved your phrase, beautiful chords going nowhere. I think a lot of Proust's contemporaries looked at the first few volumes of his book in that way. You know, where is he going with all this? I was at a dinner party not so long ago in Manhattan where my host said, "Well, I read him in college, but why hundreds of pages of lauding a steeple?" And it is that kind of, there is that kind of art for art sensibility in Proust's literary work. And it's wonderful, so I'm looking forward to hearing you guys tonight. Obviously, thank you all for your attention.